Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to connect with you again, even if remotely so. I hope that you're adjusting to life under current circumstances as best you can and being able to roll with all the changes with your classes as well. I hope it's not too overwhelming. I am certainly going to be really flexible and let me know if you need any specific help with anything. Anything you're finding particularly challenging, I'm going to do whatever I can to help you out with that. I hope you had a chance to look over the email I sent out to the whole class. I'm going to be posting all these PowerPoints as videos to my YouTube channel, and we'll have a weekly Google Hangouts time, which it's not mandatory. I've had a couple questions about that, but it's just a time that you can check in to ask questions about the course if you like. And of course, feel free to set up other times as well. So our topic for today is preserving Earth's biodiversity. This is chapter 11 out of your text. This is my new normal. Here I am recording these lectures remotely. Again, this is the first time I've ever done this, so I'm sure there are going to be some technical difficulties along the way. Just be patient with me, and any suggestions, please let me know in the comments box. So I always like to find interesting news items, and this came across my desk the other day. There's been this reduction in water level in reservoirs out west because we're using more water than is naturally coming down. This is a picture from Lake Mead where it shows water dropping in that ring along the outside of the reservoir there. And this article talked about how much water it actually takes to raise cattle. So it estimated that about a third of the water used out in the western United States is going to irrigate crops that feed cattle. So again, I think it's, sometimes we feel powerless to deal with these environmental issues that we see in front of us, but diet is one way where we can definitely have an impact. So this is sort of a shocking development to me. So last time, way back before break and all of this craziness started, we were discussing agriculture, and we talked about genetic diversity and how industrial agriculture leads to a reduction in genetic diversity, because when you invest in so much infrastructure to harvest a particular crop, it doesn't make sense to have different kinds of crops on your same field, right? You're going to invest in all one kind. But the upside of that is that we reduce the genetic diversity of our crops. And we're going to talk a little bit more about genetic diversity today, but in a different context. We mentioned that one of the ways we can artificially increase genetic diversity is through use of genetically modified organisms, and that they're different from the products of selective breeding because you're taking a gene present in a completely different species and then using biotechnology to incorporate that gene into a target species. And for the purposes of our discussion, those target species were agriculturally important species. So it's interesting, we talked about the costs and benefits of GMOs and this idea that there's lots of things GMOs could do to help with global food security. One of the things we talked about was, for instance, developing tolerance to droughts. And so this is an article that came out not too long ago, where these authors asked, where are these drought-tolerant crops from genetically modified organisms, research on GMOs. And what they concluded was that after about 20 years of research and investment, just a few of these products have reached the market. So I think the upside of this is that GMOs hold a ton of potential, but we really haven't seen that potential as far as having a big impact on global food security yet. Here in the US, several of our crops are almost entirely comprised of genetically modified organisms. So this is a figure that has the percent of US acreage in genetically modified crops on the Y, and then different crops there on the X. So you can see, right, cotton, sugar beets, soybeans, corn, and canola. These crops are almost entirely genetically modified, and many of them are modified to allow use of pesticides, like we talked about Roundup Ready the other day. So the bottom line is, with a lot of, any product that contains corn, soybeans, or canola, if it doesn't tell you that it's genetically modified and you're buying it from crops produced in the States, it probably is genetically modified. There have been some changes to rules on labeling. For a long time we didn't require any labeling of GMOs in the US at all, but this is changing now. So you can see in the bottom of this clip from a web page that starting in January 1st, 2022, companies are going to be required to label when their products contain genetically modified organisms. So they're not required to do that yet, but we've started to see some of these labels out there already. This is legislation passed in 2017. It basically gave companies 5 years to get their labeling up to speed. This is what the labels look like. They just say bioengineered or derived from bioengineering on them. So when you see these labels, they indicate that those products contain genetically modified organisms. So in the meantime, even before any kind of labeling was required, there were companies that made products that didn't contain any GMOs at all. And so third-party organizations like the Non-GMO Project offered to test products for these companies. And then if the testing indicated that they didn't contain any GMOs, then these companies had the right to put this Non-GMO Project verified label on their products. So even before the US government required any kind of GMO labeling, there were companies that proactively labeled their products as non-GMO to benefit consumers who wanted to decide whether or not the products that they consumed had GMOs in them or not. All right, so preserving Earth's biodiversity. This is the biosphere, so far as we know, the only place where life is contained on our universe, as far as we have figured out. So biological diversity then is just the diversity of life. So this is the part where I'd ask you what kinds of biodiversity exist. So just think for a moment about the diversity of life and the different categories of that we can think of. You probably thought about species diversity first, right? Simply the different number of species. So in this little image here, we've got a couple of species of fish. Of course, I've got fish in here, but there's other things too, right? There's plants there on the bottom of the stream. There's other things. So just counting the number of species is species diversity. Genetic diversity we've discussed already in the context of agriculture, and so it just describes, even within a given species, how different individuals are genetically, how different their genes are one from the other. Then the final category is what we might consider ecosystem diversity, thinking about different functions, what different kinds of roles do species play in our ecosystem. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. So starting at the lowest level, genetic diversity. So it's variation in the genetics both within and between populations. If I ask you why it's important, hopefully you'll be able to think of our agricultural example, that it provides us resistance against things like the Irish potato blight, which wiped out the crops. And the reason for that is, again, it's the raw material for evolution, right? Evolution is how species and populations respond to environmental variation. And when there's no genetic diversity, they're not able to respond, and so they can get wiped out. It's also important in an agricultural and biodiversity context because it gives potential for captive breeding. I'll show you an example of this in just a minute, but I have a picture of a cheetah here, and it's not coincidental. So what happened at the end of the last ice age, right, about 15,000 years ago, we had these sheets of ice that came down as far as Kentucky in North America, and then all across the globe there was this massive ice. So when that happened, it reduced the amount of habitat available for terrestrial species. And a lot of large mammals went extinct during that time, right? So we had saber-toothed tigers, we had woolly mammoths, we had giant sloths. You've all seen the movie Ice Age. Those species all went extinct after the last ice age. And so cheetahs almost did. Their populations really crashed. And they're very small population sizes that survived through the last ice age. So because of that, there's very low genetic diversity in cheetah populations. And this leads to issues like certain genetic diseases not being able to evolve very well. So cheetahs have really suffered as a result of low genetic diversity. If you've been to the Western North Carolina Nature Center, you've seen these guys. These are red wolves. And so red wolves were the only canine predator native to the eastern U.S., east of the Mississippi. Now, people don't often get along very well with large predators, so as populations of folks increased in the eastern United States, they hunted and reduced populations of red wolves until red wolf populations got so small that other canines were able to colonize the eastern U.S. And coyotes moved across the Mississippi into the eastern U.S. And as the numbers of these red wolves decreased, they weren't able to defend their territories against coyotes, and so coyotes came on over, and then it turns out that coyotes and red wolves can interbreed. So red wolves were listed on the Federal Endangered Species Act, or rather were proposed for listing for a while. And so to help maintain the genetic integrity of these red wolves, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service took them out of nature and then put them into different breeding centers across the U.S. One of those was the W&C Nature Center. So the idea was then that if these red wolves interbred with coyotes, they would no longer be this distinct species, which was proposed for protection under federal law. Well, long story short, primarily because there is no potential to reintroduce red wolves into nature in the future, just because coyote populations are everywhere now, they're no longer proposed for federal protection. And so I'm not sure what's going to happen to that red wolf breeding program, but they do still have red wolves at the Western North Carolina Nature Center, and you can check out. So genetic diversity is important when you bring these populations into captivity, with the notion that you'll be able to reintroduce them back into the wild later on. All right, well, what about species diversity? So again, this is simply counting up the number of species that occur in a given area. This is, again, what most of us probably think of when we hear biodiversity. We talked a little bit already about hypotheses for why there are more species in some parts of the world than others. And when we think about why this is most well known and well publicized, there's a few reasons for that. The first is that it's easier to present to the general public. If you want to talk about preserving biodiversity of an area, talking about numbers of species is easier for the public to understand than talking about genetic diversity, for instance. We can also use species as what are called flagship species. And the idea behind that is that a species can kind of carry the flag for an ecosystem. So the image there down below is the Florida panther. And the idea of a flagship species means that if we do what we need to do to preserve that particular species, then that also allows us to do what we need to do to preserve that whole ecosystem. So a species like the Florida panther, it needs large areas of undisturbed habitat. It needs prey species. And so if we were to do those things to preserve the Florida panther, we'd also be, by connection, preserving the entire ecosystem that it relies on. So a flagship species is a species that sort of represents an ecosystem, and the public can get behind preserving that species. You can literally go online and buy plush toys that are made to look like Florida panthers, and your purchase goes towards supporting conservation of the species. So it's a good way to get public support on board. And then finally, the only legal support we have for preserving biodiversity also operates at the species level. That's the Endangered Species Act, came along in 1973. And so if we want to use laws to protect biodiversity, we need to work on the species level. There are a couple exceptions where populations have been granted protection under the Endangered Species Act, or what are called sometimes evolutionarily significant units, which are populations different from the rest of the species. But in general, the Endangered Species Act works on a species-by-species basis, so that provides legal support for species protection. So just to go through a couple numbers here, if you think about how many species have been described on Earth, how many species might be there total, because we know we haven't named all the species, and then thinking a little bit about what are most of those species. So a couple of interesting questions, and this is where I would ask you your thoughts on these questions before providing your answers. So how many do you think? So there's between 1.7 and 2 million species that have been described, and that is, these are species that you can look up published accounts of them. And the reason that there's an estimate there is that there's some uncertainty about what constitutes a separate species versus subspecies. But somewhere between 1.7 and 2 million species on Earth, or that have been described. I'm sorry. But how many are there in total? We know it's a lot more. Estimates vary widely on this, anywhere between 5 and 100 million species. And this is based on research that is discovering new species all the time. And in particular, this is in areas that haven't been studied very well, areas that are very biodiverse. Think Amazon rainforest, right? Think rainforests in Indonesia, places like that. So there's a lot of species out there that we haven't been able to describe yet. Well, thinking about what most of those species are, I'm guessing if I asked you, you could probably have a pretty good idea. But this figure will kind of help us get to that. So the bar, sorry, my audio might have gotten cut off there. But this figure will really help us get to that question of what most of the species on Earth are. So that bar graph all the way to the left represents all the species that have been described. And so this estimate uses about 1 3/4 million. But about 3/4 of all the species that have been described are animals. I would argue there are lots of fungi, lots of bacteria, lots of protists that haven't been described, but the species that have been described are mostly animals. Then if we blow up that section that's lists all the animals described, what do we see? We see that insects make up about 3/4 of that. So if you do the math, insects make up about half of all the species that have ever been described. And then the bar to the right, if we look at vertebrates, which are often the species that you see the most on National Geographic, Animal Planet, whatever, we can see that in the vertebrates, fishes make up the largest piece of that pie as well. And that's really because fishes have been around longer than any other vertebrates, and so they make up more species than other things. Mammals, only about 9% of that. So insects outnumber all of the species, and they have a bit of an attitude about that. Little stag beetle here giving us its particular opinion. All right, speaking of biodiversity, I'm going to try to keep things interesting from time to time. A little bit of humor, a little bit of diversions, talk about some Nepal stuff, whatever. It's time. It's time for some fish puns. So why are fish so smart? You probably know this. Because they live in schools. You guys got any fish puns? Or do you need more time to mull it over? This fish in the background is a mullet. A mullet is not just a haircut. Listen, if you can think of a better fish pun, let me know. Well, that's enough fish puns. I think we should scale back. Okay. So, why preserve biodiversity? You might not have asked yourself this question before, but people might ask, why is it important to try and preserve species? I like to break this down a couple of different ways. There's really kind of 4 different approaches to answering this question, and we'll look at each of them. We can look at it from an economic perspective, ecological, ethical, and then what we might term an aesthetic or a spiritual perspective. So we can ask the question, what is the economic value of an intact ecosystem? And if you think about how you might go about doing that, you might remember our discussion of environmental economics and this idea of ecosystem services, and the fact that a lot of values of the environment are not market values. Well, this particular author, Robert Costanza and colleagues, tried to take a crack at estimating the dollar values of ecosystem services. So what they did was they looked at different biomes. So these are large-scale parts of the Earth that are similar ecosystems, right? So they looked at the open ocean, the coastal shelf, estuaries, all these things. Then they looked at what the main ecosystem service was for each of these biomes. They estimated the value per hectare. So if we were to do this ourselves and nature didn't do it, how much would it cost to do? Right? So for instance, estuaries, right? Those are places where saltwater and freshwater come together in marshes, places like that. They are very important from a nutrient cycling perspective. So I looked at what it would cost if we had to cycle those nutrients around, right? Think of our nitrogen cycle cartoon from earlier in the course, our phosphorus cycle cartoon from earlier in the course. How much would it cost if we had to do that in the chemistry lab instead of letting nature do it? And he estimated that would cost about $22,000 per hectare, or $23,000 per hectare. Then they multiplied that value by the total number of hectares of that type of biome to get an estimate of the total global value of that ecosystem. And these are in trillions of dollars, right? So the estimate is about $4,100 trillion is how much it would cost us if we had to process those nutrients ourselves in the lab instead of letting estuaries do it. So I think it's interesting if you look at the total value per hectare in that column and see which are the biomes that are most valuable to us globally. A lot of wetlands, right? Swamps, seagrass, those estuaries. And we see that nutrient cycling is the most important thing that they do in a lot of cases. Taking those nutrients and making them available for other plants, right? To allow our ecosystems to continue to function. So when they add up the value of all these ecosystems, it's over $33,000 trillion. I can't even wrap my head around what that value means. But the upshot of it is, it's greater than the GDP of the entire planet. So the take-home message here is that we would not be able to do this if ecosystems didn't do it for us. So essentially, these ecosystems have incredible economic value to us. So we could look at it from an ecological perspective as well. So thinking about how biodiversity affects an ecosystem, what it means to have more species versus fewer species. So there's an author named David Tillman and some other researchers at University of Minnesota, and they were studying grasslands out there. So they wanted to look at how grasslands functioned differently if they had more species in them versus fewer species. This is an aerial photo of their experimental setup. They created these little experimental plots of grasslands. Then they manipulated the number of species in each of those plots. And after their studies, they came up with some results that look like this. So they looked at the total number of species, where it says plant species richness on the x-axis. That's simply the number of species in each of these plots. So they looked in these grasslands at the total percentage of plant cover. And as you can see, there's an increasing relationship here, but it's nonlinear, right? So when we move from 0 to 5 plant species, we have a really high slope. We're really increasing the plant cover. But then as we move from 20 to 25 species out toward the end of that x-axis, we're not really increasing it a lot. So it's always important when we interpret any graph to ask ourselves, first of all, is there a positive relationship, a negative relationship, or a flat line? And the second question is that relationship linear or nonlinear? Now, plant cover, why is that important? If erosion is coming into your mind, then you're thinking along the right path. When we have higher percentage plant cover in our grasslands, it's going to reduce the amount of erosion, and that's good for our ecosystems. They also looked at the amount of nitrate that was left in the rooting zone. And again, in this case, there's a strong relationship, but a negative one. And it looks like as we move from 0 to 5 plants in these grasslands, the amount of nitrate left in the rooting zone decreases pretty rapidly. So think of this as rates of nutrient processing. So the more plants we have in our grasslands, the better those nutrients are being processed. Now remember, these authors asked the question from the perspective of, as we increase the number of plants, how do our ecosystems function? But remember, in reality, we're most concerned about this because in a lot of cases we're losing species. So you might want to move from right to left on this x-axis and ask, how does plant cover respond when we decrease the number of plants? How does plant species richness affect nitrate in our rooting zone? Similarly here, they looked at how the number of plants in the grassland affected the ability of invading species to get established, and there's a negative relationship there. And then also, the number of species had an impact on disease severity as well. So when you had only one species in this grassland, there was a higher severity of this fungal disease. So kind of like with genetic diversity, it looks like having more diversity increases increases species' ability to fight off disease. Okay, so there's two ways to get at this question of why preserve biodiversity, but there's an ethical take on it too. And I like to think about this two different ways. We can focus it on sort of life in general, what we might call a biocentric perspective, but we can even look at the value of biodiversity to us as a species in an anthropocentric perspective and say, what does it mean to lose species? So biocentrically, it can be as simple as the argument that other organisms have a right to coexist. Right? Do we have the right to drive species to extinction? Well, not if you believe that other species have an intrinsic right to coexist on this planet with us. Coming at it from a viewpoint that's more focused specifically on us, if we think of food and pharmaceutical products, right, those all come from species on this planet. All the things we eat, those are species, right? All of our pharmaceutical drugs, a lot of those are derived, of course, antibiotics originally from fungi. And then bacteria as well, all sorts of other sources. So the question is, as we lose species, how are those going to affect the drugs and food of the future? It's really hard to say. Certainly in the current global pandemic, right, we realize that there's a need to be able to keep developing pharmaceuticals, and how will our ability to do that be limited by having fewer species out there on the planet? Just one example of this, and there are many. Taxol is an anti-cancer drug that was originally isolated from the bark of the Pacific yew tree. So these are all chemicals that, this is a chemical that this plant produces naturally, but it has strong anti-cancer properties. I remember when I was in Nepal visiting a national park, and we were doing actually an elephant safari, and I was riding on the top of an elephant. And it's not good to be tall when you're on top of an elephant on a safari, because we were going under these trees and I was getting whacked with all these branches and stuff, and leaves were kind of falling off. And I remember these leaves had kind of fallen in my lap, and I kind of like roll them in my fingers and smell them, and they're just all these different aromas from all the different chemicals that were in these plants. And I remember thinking, what are the possible medicinal properties of all these plants in this in the jungle in this national forest? And we don't know, right? So as we lose species, we lose these potential sources of drugs as well. Finally, there's an aesthetic, or if you might call it a spiritual argument to preserve biodiversity, and this relates to our connection to nature. Back to Aldo Leopold, he has a quote that I like, if we talked about earlier as well. It says, "We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." Sometimes you hear the term biophilia used, right? Love for nature. People argue that's an innate part of our DNA, that we evolved in nature. We evolved with all these other species. And so there are those who argue that we have a spiritual connection to nature, and that as we lose species, we're innately losing some of that connection. All right. So I don't know how much you guys have had a chance to get out and enjoy nature, but here's at least one picture of a sunset for you. I hope you're all doing well. I know this is a challenging time. I hope you're journaling or sort of recording your thoughts during this time to think about what you're learning about yourself and about our human family all over the world in this trying time, right? I think we've been learning so much about how interconnected we all are and all the implications of that. So this pandemic is going to be a big part of your lives, So just think about, in your private times of meditation reflection, kind of what it means to you, what you're learning from it, and it'd be wonderful if we have a chance to share all those thoughts with each other. So I hope you all are well. Drop me any comments or questions you have in the comments below, and feel free to let me know if you want to discuss anything via Google Hangouts, phone, or whatever. Hope you all are doing well, and I'll talk to you soon. These videos will be coming out every Tuesday and Thursday for our class. And again, if you can make it to our Google Hangouts at a regular class time on Thursday, that's great. It's not mandatory, but feel free to drop by if you have any questions. Take care.